Welcome back to our third in this series of lockdown lectures. I'm so pleased to see all the names in the waiting room, and I'm so pleased that you made time this evening to talk about presidential portraiture. I want to start just by saying a couple of things. One, we'll take questions at the end of my talk, just as we did before. If you have questions, if they occur to you during the course of the lecture, please feel free to write your questions down using the chat function in Zoom, and then I'll take those questions at the end of the talk. I also want to say, in these strange and uncertain times, how much of a pleasure it has been for me to be with you every other week for the past 6 weeks, talking about art at the Cummer, even if we can't go down there right now ourselves in person. This has been, on my end, something of a love letter to our museums. I believe very deeply in the importance of museums. They are institutions that serve many purposes. They are diaries of our faults, and they are repositories of our hopes and our best intentions, and they are crucial to the way that we tell our own story and history. That's very much my theme tonight as we talk about telling the story of the history of the country through portraiture. So I would encourage you all, as the history unfolds before us here in this very uncertain historical year 2020, to think about how you can support the cultural institutions that make our country vital, and that connect us to beauty, and that honor our public commitment to the idea that everyone deserves access to beauty. The topic I want to address today is inspired by a painting in the Cummer collection. If you've been down there, you may well have seen the painting of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, which hangs in the American collections at the Cummer. Gilbert Stuart is perhaps the most famous American portrait painter, and certainly one of the most famous American painters of the 19th century. An extremely important figure, deeply familiar to all of us, because of course he is responsible for the image of Washington on the dollar bill. So perhaps one of the most well-known artists, at least by the impact of his images, in the history of our country. The Cummer has a painting of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, which is in fact based on that same image which adorns the dollar bill. This is a portrait which is known as the Athenaeum type portrait of George Washington, and probably by far the most famous and most familiar image of a political figure in the history of our country. This is the Athenaeum portrait itself, after which our painting was made. Stuart produced this painting, which is unfinished, quite famously unfinished, in the course of a series of sittings with Washington that led to the production of several different paintings, as a matter of fact, in the year 1795. The Athenaeum portrait is known as the Athenaeum portrait because of the repository in Boston, the Athenaeum collection, to which it was donated in the 19th century. And it was by far the most famous version of the portraits of Washington that Gilbert Stuart produced. He produced 3 main types, and he made many, many, many copies of it. In fact, he produced hundreds of copies of it. He called it later in his career his $100 bill because he charged $100 for each copy. There are not that many copies still in existence, and the Cummer is extremely fortunate to have one. In fact, it's a very fine one, and an early copy of the Athenaeum portrait. The Athenaeum portrait, however, though it's deeply familiar to us and it is on the dollar bill, is not actually the official presidential portrait of Washington. That honor goes to yet another painting by Gilbert Stuart, the Lansdowne Portrait of George Washington, which is in the National Portrait Gallery today. There are also several copies of this. It's a larger portrait, a full-length portrait, rather than just a bust portrait. It's ironic, though, to find that the most famous image of Washington is not the official image of Washington. And for us today, that poses a question: what makes an image of a president. What is an official presidential portrait supposed to look like? And to answer that question, I want to start with the beginning and the end, with the first and the last presidential portrait to have been made in our history to this point. The first portrait of Washington by Gilbert Stuart, and the last portrait of Barack Obama by the artist Kehinde Wiley, which was completed in 2018. We'll have to wait a few years still for the next official presidential portrait, because these portraits are generally completed after the tenure of the president who occupies the office. The images between this beginning and the ending will fill in the story and in many ways chart the progress of our self-consciousness as a country. Here we are a couple of days before July 4th. I think this is a very opportune time to think and to reflect on what we have as an image in our popular consciousness of the country and what we have in our official record in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington as a visual record of the image of our country. The Lansdowne Portrait is, as I say, the first official portrait that, the first official presidential portrait. It's also a quite distinctive one. Washington is very regal and he stands in an extremely regal setting, an image which in many ways is discordant from our notions of the beginning of the American experiment with democracy. As I said, it is not the only portrait that Gilbert Stuart produced of Washington, nor is it even the most famous portrait. The very first portrait that Gilbert Stuart produced is known as the Vaughn Portrait by its early collector, and a number of copies exist of this as well. I dare say most of you have never seen a copy of the Vaughn Portrait because it is not particularly well known.
All right, let me tell you, I found it.
There's someone who is, there we go. Just had to mute someone, sorry. The Vaughn Portrait is quite distinctive in its own right. However, it is not the one that is iconically familiar to us as the portrait of George Washington. Among the other copies of the Vaughn Portrait, there are quite a few in prominent collections, including here at the Metropolitan Museum. You see there's slight variations among the different examples, and that's true also of the Athenaeum type portraits and the Lansdowne type portraits. The Athenaeum type portrait is, for us, of course, the most famous. Now, there's a lot of interest in the fact that it's unfinished, and that itself is quite relevant to our understanding of the artist, Gilbert Stuart. Stuart was an extremely important American painter of the 19th century. He was, however, ironically, a loyalist before the revolution ended in the Americans' favor. He was a loyalist, and the family moved to Canada in the course of the revolution. He spent much of his life and his training years in England, studying with painters in England. However, he made his name and he made his career painting George Washington when he returned to America after the conclusion of the revolution. He first had a sitting with Washington for the Vaughn Portrait, but was very unsatisfied with George Washington as a sitter. He said that he never saw someone who went so slack and vacuous and appeared so apathetic the minute he began to sit down for a portrait. And Stuart was used to teasing and playing with his figures to make them to come alive and to laugh and to show expression. But Washington just went blank, which was frustrating to Stuart. The Athenaeum Portrait is unfinished in part because, of course, this was made during a series of sittings, and it was produced in some ways as a sketch. But there's quite a lot of speculation among art historians also about how this connects with Gilbert Stuart's personality. Stuart is, today, we would call him bipolar. He was afflicted throughout his life by periods of mania and depression. And there's quite a bit of speculation that he was so attached to this version of his image of Washington that he dared not go back to it after he left work on it incomplete. He was afraid to spoil it by adding anything new. And it's certainly true that the Athenaeum style portrait has a freshness. It has an incredibly interesting quality that is so very deeply very deeply and freshly, originally alive, because the figure himself is unfinished. He seems to be coming into being. There's an inchoate quality as the brush strokes around the halo of finished paint surrounding the head, as they fade out and become looser as we go into the distance. That unfinished quality is quite iconic, and the patrons who patronized Gilbert Stuart themselves were deeply interested in having copies of this image, which Stuart retained as a master copy in his own studio throughout the rest of his career. So he seemed to have something, an unfinished portrait made from life that was connected to his sitter in a very intimate way that seemed to extend to the copies an extra connection. That is, of course, the source for our painting at the Cummer of Gilbert Stuart's Washington. There are many versions of this Athenaeum type portrait that still survive. Most of them are in extremely prominent collections, the Corcoran and the Met and the St. Louis Art Museum. So we're quite fortunate to have a copy here, and in fact, a copy that was painted closer than many to the date of the original production of the work. These Athenaeum type portraits were primarily commissioned and collected by private individuals. In other words, they were not really official portraits. They were images that satisfied the collective national curiosity in the first president, people who admired Washington, people who heroized him. It's only when in 1869, the Athenaeum portrait provided the image on the dollar bill that we began to have this broadly national idea that the Athenaeum portrait represented Washington to posterity. And that continues, of course, down to the present day. We see the very first dollar bill featuring Washington in 1869 and a representative example from the last decade. The official portrait, as I say, though, however, was the Gilbert Stuart portrait. The Lansdowne Portrait, which was commissioned not by the country. It was not painted for even an American. It was commissioned by William Petty, the Marquess of Lansdowne in England, and it was commissioned by him to commemorate, we believe, the signing of the Jay Treaty, an early treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom, which finalized some of the lingering details about the relationship of the two countries after the revolution. So multiple copies of this exist, and it has been in our hands for a number of decades now as the official portrait of George Washington. When Gilbert Stuart was painting both the Athenaeum portrait, the Lansdowne portrait, and the Vaughn portrait, he was engaged in, whether he knew it or not, creating a new tradition of portraiture. There was, of course, no tradition of official portraiture in the United States. And that first generation of elected officials and national officials, the idea of what they ought to look like was a very much an open question. And so Gilbert Stuart, in many ways, was drawing on history and tradition. The Lansdowne type portrait is a portrait that was commissioned to mark a specific event, the signing of the Jay Treaty. And we can compare that to, for instance, from ancient Roman traditions, full-length statues that were also often generally commissioned to commemorate specific victories or specific events in history. The fact of the matter is that usually the Romans were too cheap to produce full-length statues or portraits of their leaders. They could get by very easily with busts, which were smaller, more portable, cheaper, and served the purpose of bringing the image of the leader before the people. These are the types of things that you would find throughout the Roman Empire in cities and in courthouses and in magistracy offices and other places where the business of the empire was done. We can compare that, of course, to the bust type Athenaeum portrait by Gilbert Vaughn. Most of these portraits, just like the Athenaeum type portraits, were copies. In fact, the Romans had a very sophisticated system for copying works of art, producing near virtual identical copies of a single model, much as Gilbert Stuart produced copies with slight differences based on the Athenaeum type. These are all bust portraits of the Roman Emperor Trajan. However, Stuart had other sources as well. He was looking likewise at contemporary European portraiture, in particular portraits of rulers. This is tremendously ironic, but we have to admit the fact that George Washington's Lansdowne Portrait is based on traditions of royal and imperial portraiture in 18th century Europe. We can compare the image, for instance, here to Louis Michel van Loo's portrait of Louis XV, the King of France. We see very much the same environment, the column and the table spread with a luxurious velvet cloth, the leg of the table bared, a throne-like chair with a red velvet and gilt character. The king or the president stands in the center of the image and makes an oratorical or a gesture of speech. The table, meanwhile, is bedecked with ornaments that pertain to the identity of the man. Now, there's no crown for George Washington, but there is a silver inkwell and pot with his coat of arms on the table, with which he used the quill to sign the Jay Treaty. We can compare this, for instance, also to Anton van Maren's portrait of Francis I, the Emperor of the Holy German Empire. Very similar structures. So ironically, our artist, Gilbert Stuart, is drawing on royal traditions to make the first image of a democratic leader. The Lansdowne portrait is richly significant in other ways as well. It is full, absolutely full of symbolism. For instance, the table leg is adorned with eagles, in which we recognize in their claws clutches of arrows that refer to the Great Seal and the symbol of the United States, of the presidency of the United States of America, and the old E pluribus unum, 13 arrows in the claw, representing the 13 original colonies. We see the table leg that is clearly revealed to us by this cloth which rises up and reveals the gilded table leg. The table leg is made out of what we call a fasces. Now, this is an ancient Roman symbol that we find in many places in American art and history. The fasces is a bundle of rods tied together, often around an axe handle. It was a symbol of the ancient Roman Republic, and specifically a symbol of strength and authority. The idea is that the bundle of rods tied together represent a republican environment, which many are drawn together to create one strong form, E pluribus unum. And of course, tied together, these rods are much stronger and more unbreakable than one slender rod by itself. So the table leg is a fasces, and we have eagles clutching arrows. The fasces is a symbol which is still very much alive in American life, despite the fact that it is also the source for the word or the concept of fascism, which in the 20th century, long after George Washington, became a Roman nationalist, Italian nationalist political concept under Mussolini and other political leaders of the 20th century. And the idea of the Roman fasces acquired a completely new, and for us today, an extremely noxious meaning. Nevertheless, the ceremonial mace of the US House of Representatives is still fashioned after the ancient Roman fasces. And if you go visit the Oval Office, you'll find, for instance, a fasces molding adorning the doorway of the Oval Office. There are other highly symbolic objects in this space. Under the table, we find books which are representative of the foundation here of the country. The Constitution and Laws of the United States of America, the American Revolution, are the two books which we find leaning against the table leg formed in the metal in the fasces shape. These books underneath the table form something like a foundation of law, foundation of history, on which the table rises, the leg ascending to the top, where the table is piled with papers with the ink pot bearing George Washington's coat of arms, and the papers which themselves represent the business and the ongoing work of the country. So behind Washington, we see the columns, which we saw, for instance, in the previous portraits of the European kings and leaders. For centuries, literally going back to the Renaissance, portraits are very common. It's very common to find columns in portraits of people in power. The column was a symbol in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance of fortitude, of the virtue of strength and of fortitude. And so in this context, behind Washington, that column repeats that meaning and that message. We might think, of course, that there's some reference here to the architecture, for instance, of Washington, D.C., which is filled with its columns and its monuments. But of course, none of those existed when George Washington was painted by Gilbert Stuart. In fact, he had just commissioned the construction of the White House and is the only president who never occupied the White House. So Gilbert Stuart has very much invented this environment rather than adapted it from a current monument. Highly symbolic, of course, in the background, we find a rainbow from a storm that has just broken out. We see the clouds dissipating down below, and the rainbow represents, of course, peace and reconciliation after the storm of the Revolution, and connected likewise to the idea of the signing of the treaty, which finalized and concluded many of the hostilities that lingered between England and the United States. So this is a painting and a precedent that's extremely important. It establishes for the very first time what a president of the United States looks like, and it also establishes a symbolic structure within which the president exists. We'll see a lot of these elements repeat again and again in later portraits, because of course, this precedent-setting portrait of Washington was something that later presidents looked to. Without making themselves look like Washington, they looked to this picture to borrow things that could contribute to their own image as president. The table, the books, the papers, the column, and especially the chair. Now, the chair is extremely important. This image of the chair is rather throne-like, and Washington does not sit in it, and he rises out of the chair as though he's just risen, and he clutches a sword. Not a sword like you would carry into battle, but what would have been in the 18th century a dress sword or a ceremonial sword, a sword of office. And the chair functions in the same way, as a symbol of office, of the seat of power. Of course, that's a common metaphor that we use for talking about a person in power. If you've ever served on a committee anywhere, you probably, of course, had a chairperson for that committee. The chair is a resonant symbol for us of authority. And in the American democratic context, the idea of an authority which is not dependent on the individual. That is, anyone can sit in the chair. A person is not a chair. The chair is occupied by a person. And when the person rises, the chair is open to be filled again by someone new. So if that's the first presidential portrait, what does the second official presidential portrait look like? John Trumbull, another very famous and important American painter to whom I'm very partial because he was buried in the basement of my department building at Yale University on High Street. I used to go down and visit his grave regularly. The John Trumbull portrait of John Adams is radically different from our image of George Washington. In fact, so different that we have to ask what's going on here. There's a kind of Puritan simplicity that takes us back to the idea of the humility of the individual in a democratic system. But this is not a faithful representation of the way portraits of the founding fathers were made. In fact, we have to measure this image against the emerging idea of a presidential image based on Washington's image. The National Portrait Gallery could well have chosen a different image of John Adams. For instance, how about John Adams' own version of the Lansdowne Portrait? He had the painter William Winstanley paint himself in very much the same style and guise as Washington in the Lansdowne portrait. But our image of John Adams in the official record is very different. I think these early portraits, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson as painted by Rembrandt Peale, all of these images are intentionally different from the image of Washington, precisely in order to reinforce the specialness of Washington. These are not images in which there's a regal or an imperial pretension, in which there's any sense of the individual's ambition for power or their authority beyond the sense of their presence, beyond their personality and their engagement with us. Madison is the first figure, the fourth position in our line of presidents, who brings back some little symbol. In this case, the column peeking out from behind the curtain repeats that image of fortitude. Likewise, Madison sits, although we're barely able to see it, in a chair, whereas the previous two sitters were just busts floating against a blank and empty space. So the chair and the column begin to bring back into the line of portraits some sense of the symbolic structure carrying over from Washington's portrait. James Monroe, who gazes off spiritually into the distance, and Andrew Jackson complete this series of early presidents and early presidential portraits that focus simply on the bust of the figure. So rather than the Lansdowne picture, which was commissioned to mark a specific event, the conclusion of the revolution, these other pictures of presidents represent them in much more abstract terms, as individuals characterized by their personality, characterized by their facial expressions, the sense of their soulfulness or their integrity as human beings. Andrew Jackson's picture does have one little distinctive feature. It features a sunset in the background, which is an atmospheric effect that we can compare to the rainbow breaking out in the Lansdowne portrait. In all likelihood, Andrew Jackson, who had this painting made very close to the end of his life and his career, was positioning himself as something of an elder statesman, and also as a figure who, at the end of the day, so to speak, had held America together during a difficult time. Who knows what tomorrow will bring is something the picture seems to ask of us. Once the strong and capable leader Jackson is gone, he seems to say, "You'll better watch out." And if that was what the painting intended to say, that of course was prescient, because the next 2 decades in American life were incredibly tumultuous. In fact, it's not until the 1650s, just before the outbreak of the Civil War, that we begin to see more presidential portraits. The chronological line of the production of these official portraits in our official record is broken then. And we pick the story back up with George Peter Alexander Healy, who is, like Gilbert Stuart, an extremely influential portrait painter in American history, who produced a series of presidential portraits in the mid-19th century that really set in paint the characteristics of the presidential portrait going forward. This is his image of John Quincy Adams, who of course was president much earlier. So this painting was made decades after John Quincy Adams served as president. And it's based, as you can see, on the Lansdowne portrait. It's not the same table, but it is the same books underneath the table. In fact, the spine of this book is exactly the spine of this book. It reads, "This is the Constitution and laws of the United States of America." He sits in a similar chair and he places his hand on a table covered with papers, in this case, a paper that bears a copy of the Athenaeum Portrait of George Washington. Meanwhile, a portico colonnade in the background alludes perhaps to the architecture of the White House, but also, of course, to the columns in the Lansdowne portrait. John Quincy Adams and George Peter Healy here are asserting something totally new that we haven't seen before. Now, the presidential portrait refers to the tradition of presidential portraiture in an explicit way. This is a painting that looks back on the tradition of the presidency to this point and places the figure in the painting in that line of succession and tradition. At a moment in time, of course, when that succession was very much threatened. In 1858, on the eve of the outbreak of the Civil War, we see Alexander Healy, George Peter Alexander Healy, creating a new image of the presidency, which is menaced in real time by war and by the threatened dissolution of the Union. Here is his painting of Franklin Pierce, one of our less memorable and less useful presidents, but painted in the same style here in the Lansdowne type portrait, with the table and the foundation of books beneath, and the chair, which refers to the office of the presidency, and the papers on the top of the table. Likewise here, we see a variation, which Healy introduces, of the figure simply standing next to the table. No chair on the left in the painting of Polk, but a chair behind Martin van Buren, and they hold stacks of papers, which refer, again, topically to the idea of the business, the actual work of the president. Healy is engaged in creating an iconography of the presidency. And that is particularly interesting in relation to this painting of John Tyler. All of these paintings are done within a year of each other, 1858, 1859. This is the first painting in which there's an extremely contemporary and topical thing in the picture. Most of our paintings to this point have been sort of timeless in some ways, tables and chairs, but now we have a newspaper. And a newspaper is quite a fascinating thing because, of course, it's a disposable object. It really only pertains to the moment at hand, to this day, to the news of the day. And to have in an official painting, an image of a president recorded for all time, holding a crumpled piece of newspaper, which presumably would be thrown out. This isn't the Jay Treaty. This is something that now introduces the idea that the president is a political figure, that it is the news of the day that defines the presidency and that defines the priorities and the business of the president. That itself is a very modern idea. Rather than being king for all time or being a kind of heroic figure, here's a man who is torn by current topical events, which we may not remember in the future, but are disruptive in his own life and time. Maybe there's a lesson there for us as we think about the things that disturb and disrupt our own lives in the present. How will the future remember the news of our day? A very similar effect we find in Millard Fillmore's picture. This here is a copy of the Constitution on the desk. We see the chair, we see the table, but through the background now we see for the first time the US Congress building. Now this painting was made in 1857, and the US Congress building had just been renovated, largely expanded, and opened in 1857. So this is a brand new thing tucked away in the background there that for us seems timeless because we feel like the Congress building, the Capitol building has always been there, but in 1857 would have been an incredibly new and fresh reference to the political landscape of the day. The anomaly among George Peter Alexander Healy's paintings is his portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And it's an anomaly in several ways, one of which is that Lincoln actually sat for this picture, whereas many of the other pictures were made from photographs. Lincoln sat for this picture before his death in 1864, and Healy reflected for many years on his painting of Lincoln, which was not completed until 1869. It's very different from his others. He omits all of the things. There's no papers. There's not even a table. There are no books. There's nothing in the background. The focus here is intensely on Lincoln himself. And we get a keen sense of his personality. The way that he leans forward in his chair is an active pose. So instead of referring to the actions of the presidency by way of a symbol like a sheaf of papers, we have instead that active, dynamic pose of Lincoln as he leans forward and as he engages in our space. There's another issue here as well, which is that Lincoln is represented full length, not standing, sitting. Most of our pictures to this point have been pictures of people in chairs or standing, but we don't see most of these figures in full length. They're cut off at the knees. The chair is depicted to the point just below the apron of the chair. There are a lot of variations. Lincoln's is one we have not seen yet to this point. In fact, Healy based this image on another painting known as the Peacemakers, which hangs today in the White House. The Peacemakers represents Lincoln with another future president, Ulysses S. Grant, and other generals of the Civil War, talking at the end of the war about how to make the peace. And we see perhaps a reference to the Lansdowne portrait, the rainbow breaking out in the sky in the background through the window. Healy actually took the image of the president, which is the official portrait, from his sketches for this painting, which represent Lincoln leaning forward in his chair, surrounded by other individuals and discussing. But of course, his painting of the official Lincoln is very different for its absence of other figures. Lincoln stands alone on a stage in a quiet reverie or a silent monologue. Here is the Peacemakers hanging in the Oval Office itself. From there, from that point on to the end of the 19th century, we primarily have variations on the new models that Alexander Healy has introduced. For instance, there's this seated figure, which we just saw in Ulysses S. Grant, to here the standing portrait of Rutherford B. Hayes with his hand on a sheaf of papers on a table, to a minor variation with Chester Arthur standing with the column in the background, the symbol of fortitude, his hand resting on a pedestal, which is adorned with a classical bas-relief depicting justice holding her scales, symbolic elements that reflect on the accumulation of symbolic forms in the presidential portraits to this point. Grover Cleveland is a variation on these ideas, and Eastman Johnson's portrait. Likewise, Benjamin Harrison, books, table. It's not until the turn of the century that we find something new. Here we have a different figure in some ways, William McKinley, who takes his glasses off, a spontaneous gesture, which a little bit like the newspaper creates a sense of presence and of the now. He holds in his hand a note as though he's just stopped reading it because he's been interrupted by us. And he gazes imperiously at us. This painting is different for, among other reasons, it's the first one painted by a woman. Harriet A.S. Murphy, who was a very important, successful portrait painter in the late 19th and early 20th century. Harriet Murphy, however, painted under her husband's name. Her husband was a painter too. She was a better painter than him, but they could earn more money if they were selling their work as the work of a man. So she painted all the pictures and signed his name, and he ran the business. Nevertheless, it is the first painting by a woman. The painting of Theodore Roosevelt by John Singer Sargent, by far the most famous painter, probably to have painted a presidential portrait, is also a departure. In many ways, a departure that's as radical as that of Barack Obama. To this point, we've seen a very consistent style in our portraits, a style that has not changed really in almost a century. Sargent introduces a new and a modern style, an Impressionist style, and he omits all of the cumbersome symbols that have been in these pictures to this point. There's no table, there is no chair, there's no column. There's instead Teddy Roosevelt gazing at us, looking a little bit piqued, as a matter of fact, and no doubt he was. Sargent was bugging him to sit, and Roosevelt wouldn't sit, despite the fact that he'd hired Sargent to come paint a picture because the first presidential portrait they made of Roosevelt, he couldn't stand. So he hired Sargent to come in and do one, but Sargent couldn't make him sit still to do a sitting for the painting. And finally, as he was bugging him, Roosevelt turns as he's about to ascend a staircase, and he barks at Sargent, and Sargent said, "That's it, that's exactly the face that I want." This is not just an interesting anecdote, it is something totally new. It is a shift in our notion of the presidential portrait as something that speaks to the personality, the psychology of the president in an intimate way that we have not seen before. That gives us the Impressionist image of Taft, and here Woodrow Wilson seated in a chair holding a book, a reference no doubt to the fact that he is the only president to hold a PhD, a scholar. And Warren G. Harding, who stands in an eminently vague impressionist space with an image of the Capitol building looming behind. and Calvin Coolidge in a very Spartan and spare environment with a very simple chair. Franklin D. Roosevelt, who inaugurates now another new tradition, an image of presidents seated casually in chairs and very accessible to us. You can see that this is not a full-length image of the figure. We seem to be very close to him, and as we are with Harry S. Truman, with the Capitol building in the background, and even more so with Herbert Hoover, who hated his first presidential portrait, so years and decades later had a second one painted to replace it. And even more so with Dwight Eisenhower, we seem to be introduced close up to the presidential sitter. In fact, we seem to be in his space and he seems to be attending to us. In fact, with Ike especially, we begin to see the president as a friend, as an acquaintance, as perhaps an uncle, a grandpa, someone who is open to our approach. That changes, of course, with John F. Kennedy, whose painting is elegiacal, it's funereal, and was painted obviously posthumously in 1970. And the downcast expression and the pale and faded color scheme of the picture refers, of course, to the tragic assassination. But the friendly version picks up again with Lyndon Johnson and, ironically, Richard Nixon, and especially Gerald Ford, who really does look like your grandpa if he was a banker and smoked a pipe. And Jimmy Carter. All of these are very consistent. We seem to be settling down now into an extremely normative image of the president as a guy who we see from the knees up, seated in a chair, smiling at us. That continues with Reagan, though he's not in a chair, and we reintroduce the column, making a reference perhaps back to the Lansdowne portrait in some way. It all changes with George Bush, changes again. Now, George Bush and the subsequent presidents through George W. Bush introduced a new, very deeply historically self-conscious mode. And what we see here with George H.W. Bush standing next to a globe and a chair, and in front of Healy's painting of the Peacemakers, we see Bush placing himself on the stage of history. In fact, it makes me think of the great Shakespeare quote, "All the world's a stage and we are but the players making our entrances and our exits." There is a sense in this painting and the subsequent ones that by now we've reached a point of maturity in the presidency, and it appears that, in fact, you, the president, are simply the latest occupant of an office that has a life that goes long beyond before and after you. That's true also here in Clinton's painting, where the presidential challenge coins or challenge medals in the background refer to the activities that he undertook as president. He stands touching the desk in an almost wistful way, in a sense that that touch, as soon as it's broken, represents the end, the conclusion of his term of office. And here also George W. Bush, who has very much the same gesture. I interpret that gesture of touching the back of the chair as very much like the gesture one makes when you're touching a beloved space the last time you see it. When you leave your childhood home, when you sell your childhood home, one last lingering touch as he reflects on the Oval Office. I do interpret this painting of Bush as very much one that is reflective not on his term in office, but on the office itself. We see in the background on the wall, in reference back to our Frederic Remington lecture with which we started, not a Remington, but another painting, a cowboy painting from the period by a Remington-inspired artist, William Kerner, which George Bush loved and kept on the back wall of the Oval Office. It all changes again with Barack Obama, or does it? Now, when this painting debuted a few years ago, it was tremendously controversial. A lot of people said, it's totally different from everything that's come before it. Some people decried the fact that it was different, and some people celebrated the fact that it was different. On the other hand, I had a question. Well, how different really is it than the previous presidential portraits that we've seen? it is obviously different in some ways. In the same ways, for instance, that we might say Barack Obama was different. He doesn't look like the presidents who came before him. He certainly has more color. And in that sense, the painting acknowledges that this is a different president. But on the other hand, it's deeply consistent with some traditions, both of art history and of presidential portrait making. The artist who painted it is perhaps today the most famous living American artist, Kehinde Wiley, a tremendous artist, really extraordinary, who we have to understand in order to understand what's happening in Obama's portrait. Kehinde Wiley is a tremendously skilled painter, and who takes his paintings of contemporary African-American males and bases them on historical models. In other words, he's very interested in the historical roots or basis for his pictures. This is a contemporary African-American male posing in a painting based on St. Anthony of Padua. And likewise here, this marvelous painting, Sleep. These paintings are incredibly distinctive and extraordinarily beautiful, characterized by this distinctive decorative background, this decorative floral background, and of course, the monumental bodies of African-American men with brilliant colors and lusters in their skin. In fact, Kehinde Wiley speaks about this. He wants to create pictures which have a dazzling effect, bling and of luster. The monumental scale of these pictures is also important to understand and acknowledge. You can see how large that painting, Sleep, is. As I said, Kehinde Wiley bases his compositions frequently on historical paintings. In this case, on not a painting, but a stained glass window designed by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Stained glass is a wonderful example of a medium that inspires Kehinde Wiley. It is itself a medium of light. And oftentimes, if you're in a cathedral on a very bright day and the light is coming straight in through a window, it's hard to see the figure because the light is so intense. There's a dazzling quality. And of course, the decorative character of stained glass windows competes with our understanding of the figure, both in the renso and the vine scrolls and the decorative elements that surround the figure, and in often the figure itself. On very bright days, the faces of stained glass figures look almost overexposed because the light is so intense. And we see in Kehinde Wiley's figures a similar quality of intensity of light on the lips and the cheeks and the features and characteristics of his sitters. In the decorative backgrounds of his pictures, Kehinde Wiley is inspired by other historical artworks. We can make a comparison here to, for instance, the famous unicorn tapestry in Paris at the Musée de Cluny, with that foliate background. We call it a mille fleurs background. And this medium, which is highly decorative, it bears comparison also in terms of the materiality of the work. These tapestries were woven with gold and silver thread often, and with precious dyes, in which the material, the splendor of the color of the material competes with the subject matter. And I think that's true of Kehinde Wiley's pictures as well, where we can see that the design seems to even overtake the figure himself, as the figure competes with the decorative environment in which he's placed. And that's a criticism that many people made of Barack Obama's portrait, that the setting in which Obama is placed seems to compete with the figure. We can compare Kehinde Wiley, for instance, to William Morris, the 19th century decorative artist who designed such beautiful prints and patterns and wallpapers. We can compare to medieval manuscripts in which the image of the saint, who would theoretically be the focus of our image, is overwhelmed in many ways by decorative profusions and brilliant colors and actual gold which shine and reflect and draw the eye. All of this relates to Kehinde Wiley's interest in the subject of his figures, in their being seen. Essentially, what he's doing is he's engaged in making African-American bodies be seen. They are impossible to miss, even as they compete with their surroundings, their equally spectacular decorative environments. But there's this intensity of visuality in Kehinde Wiley's pictures that compel us to see the subjects, to notice them, they stand out extraordinarily, even as they compete with their immediate environments. We can compare that, for instance, also to historical painting, for instance, by Jan van Eyck, in which the Virgin and Child here, and the detail from this painting of Canon Vanderpeel, compete with the rug and the tapestry and even the bottle glass windows in the background. Our eyes are drawn to look, but in looking, we see not only the decorative setting, but also the figure that occupies that space. In Kehinde Wiley's portrait of Barack Obama, that very much is the dynamic, this competition between the verdant space in which the figure is set and the figure himself. And Kehinde said there is, he acknowledged, in fact, in a quote, that there is a competition which he intended between the setting and the figure. The setting in which Obama is placed is symbolic. The flowers, the chrysanthemums and the jasmine and the African violets refer to Obama's places, to his history. The jasmine flowers, state flower of Hawaii, and the chrysanthemums, the connected to Chicago, the state flower of Illinois, and the African violets, a reference to his Kenyan heritage. All of that coming together, but seeming almost to grow over him. And Kehinde Wiley articulated this in terms of the question whether Barack Obama is a man unto himself or a man who's just simply defined by his history and his antecedents. That is, he is in conflict with the story that we tell about him and about his past. His individuality, his independence from that story, his ability to write his own story is at stake in this competition with the greenery which appears to be trying to grow over him. There is, of course, another way to look at this. There's a long tradition of transformational presidential portraits, and I agree that Obama's is one of them. We have to start, of course, with Gilbert Stuart, who was inventing the tradition whole cloth, and we have to look at all of the other transformational examples, which were transformational in perhaps different ways than Obama's, but each one of them bringing something new and contributing something altogether unexpected to the ingredients of what makes the image of the presidency. There's space in this area for transformation, for reinvention, for the expansion of our notions of what the presidency looks like. And that's certainly true, I think, in our image of Barack Obama, which is ultimately based more or less directly on another presidential portrait. It is not the same chair, but it's a very similar chair. And I think even the sheen and shine on the lustrous wood in both of these chairs is something that inspired Kehinde Wiley here. It is, of course, Lincoln's portrait, which underlies and provides the bones of the structure of Obama's portrait. The two men who have so much that we can say about their relationships historically, both transformational in different ways, and both leaning forward here in this pose of action, but also both crucially represented not up close. These are not like the presidential portraits of Grandpa Ike and Uncle Gerald Ford. These men are distant from us. In fact, they are, that distance is imposed by the fact that we see them. We're placed slightly below them in our point of view perspective. They appear almost to be on a stage, as actors on a stage. And that distance creates a sense of our distance from them, a speculative distance, a place within which we cannot simply relate to them intimately, within which we must question their relationship to us and the messages that they have for us as citizens of a country which is embodied by the office, the chair, the seat of the president. So in that context, I think that we have to look at Barack Obama's presidential portrait, both as disruptive and transformative, but also as continuous and consistent with a long history of defining the presidency, not in terms of the person who sits in the chair at this moment in time, but in terms of the long history of that chair, an office, a position, and a seat of authority whose leadership we hope will guide us for the decades to come and to a future that is kind and inclusive and generous and that nourishes our souls, the souls of all people in this country and around the world. I really do love and think very highly of our country, and I think very highly of the people in it. And I hope that we will take this year, this very difficult year, and this celebration of July 4th to reflect on the past that has brought us to this point and to the possibilities for our future. I thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions, and I would ask you all to do good things and think good thoughts as we find our way forward in the next few months. Going to pull up our questions here. So the first one here, red is abundant throughout these portraits. What concepts or emotions is red known for? Please tell us about your paintings on your background wall. Okay, yeah, there's a lot of red on the background there too. So red, yes, is quite abundant. Red is a color, of course, that is associated with our country, and it's also a rich color, red velvet and red dyed fabrics. But it's also a masculine color, and in a lot of contexts is used to communicate ideas of virility and power. I read a study once that suggested that all things being equal, sports teams that have dominant red colors are more successful on the field of play than sports teams that have other colors. Whether or not that's true, we have these strong associations between virility, power, strength, blood, passion, sacrifice, values and qualities that are certainly connected to our idea of power, leadership, and for better or worse, a patriarchal power in this country. We have yet to have a female president, and maybe we can cross that off the list in the near future. But the fact of the matter is that red, I think, is connected to that sense of masculine virility. It's an appropriate color for figures in power. The paintings on my wall in the background are actually by an old student of mine, I'll give her a shout out here, Jennifer Pounds, Jennifer Nell Lale, who was a student of mine when I first came to UNF, and I liked her work, and I bought a bunch of her paintings for my wife many years ago. So what paradigm change allowed painters to depict emotions? That's a great question. So certainly as we approach the modern age, as we come into the 20th century, the interest in the personality, the psychology of the individual becomes more pronounced, not just in portraiture, but across the fields of art, and not just in visual art. Telling people stories and connecting in an emotional and empathetic way, that's an increasingly important theme, of course, in modern art, literature, music. So the effective power of the image. So it's nothing specifically to do, of course, with the presidential portraiture or even portraiture itself. Part of it is, as we've moved into contemporary culture and contemporary civilization, our sense of the dimensions of our humanity and our sense of shared humanity in institutions like the democratic United States of America, in which there is not an assumption that power, authority, and personal meaning travel through heredity or travel through inherited power structures. It's obviously much more complicated than that, and we should get some of my colleagues in sociology and history to come and comment on it too. But that's my answer for now. Do all presidents choose their own portrait painters? No. So many of these portraits were painted during the life of the portrait of the sitter, of the president. Some of them were painted long after that person was president. So for instance, Herbert Hoover did not like his first presidential portrait, and 2 decades later insisted on another one being painted. Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, rejected his first portrait and hired Sargent to come and paint one. But other presidents, of course, had nothing to do with the making of their portraits. Healy painted en masse a whole bunch of earlier presidents in 1570, 1857, 58, including John Quincy Adams, who had been president 3 decades earlier. So that's not entirely consistent. I think what is more interesting is the question of how the National Portrait Gallery that curates our collection of official portraits has decided in many cases to select what the line of presidential portraits looks like. Why do Obama's hands look disproportionately large? Well, I don't know. I suppose we might have some question about Kehinde Wiley's proportioning of the figure. It is an unusual picture, spatially in a number of ways, because Obama is in a flat, spaceless environment. And so we don't have the recession even of a space like the one in which Lincoln is depicted to allow us to interpret visually the cues of perspective that help us to understand proportion in paintings. So we have to acknowledge the fact that Kehinde Wiley just doesn't care at some level about what we think of as optically true perspective. He has created an intentionally flat backdrop. And within that space, we have a figure, Obama, which is spatially complex because of the way that he leans forward. So certain features of his body are closer to us, but it's also impossible to say that they're closer to us because there's no true space within the picture. So that, I think, might account for part of it. But hands also are symbols of agency, and they're symbols of doing. That's what we do our work with. I think it's entirely appropriate, perhaps at a symbolic level, to think of his large hands, and hands are also personal. They bear the scars and the wrinkles and the marks of our age and of our occupations. And I think that perhaps those hands are intentionally emphasized because they are markers of personal identity. There are really only 2 things that we see of Obama here: his hands and his face. You can't count the suit, right? That's just covers him up. So I certainly think that Kehinde Wiley was interested here in expressive hands, and perhaps for that reason has given them more real estate in the picture. Any of the portraits generate controversy? If so, which generated the most? Well, we have to say, I think by far the one that generated the most is Barack Obama's. You know, it may not be the end of the story. The next one may generate as much or more. We'll see. But Barack Obama certainly generated a great deal of controversy. I would say probably it's the first time in the history of the curation of the National Portrait Gallery that anybody has really taken an interest in what presidents are supposed to look like. And for that, I think controversy can often be useful in terms of drawing people's attention to the larger question of the history of the institution of the presidency and of our position as viewers and participants in that tradition, our sense of what the presidency means to us. Have there been other portraits that were controversial? I can't say off the top of my head that I know for sure. Certainly Lincoln's portrait was an important one, painted shortly after his assassination and unveiled in that context. And Washington's likewise. I have no doubt that there were a lot of people, if we went back and did some research, who had mixed feelings about the image of Washington in this regal pose in a young democracy. And how would you envision a portrait of a female president? Now, that's a great question. So I'm an art historian, I'm not a painter. But I can't wait to give you my analysis of the first one. That's a great question. I think if I were the painter, I would definitely approach this as a historical question. And the first question I would have is, well, what does the tradition of the presidency look like? And in that context, it's very useful to have Barack Obama because you have something that really is disruptive. And it allows you to say, it's possible to do something that is new, that people recognize as new, especially to acknowledge when something new has transpired that deserves our acknowledgement. So that's the first thing. And of course, there are traditions of female portraiture as well. And we have the portraits of the first ladies, although I'm not sure that they would be terribly applicable, except perhaps for some of the recent ones, in particular Michelle Obama's portrait, which is fascinating in itself. Very good question. If I had to guess, what do I think President Trump's portrait will look like stylistically? Stylistically, I imagine that it will be more traditional. In fact, there we actually have Trump's history to go by. Many of you have probably seen earlier portraits of Donald Trump, who has already commissioned quite a few oil paintings of himself, which hang in various Trump properties. And I've seen quite a few of them. In fact, I almost included some as a possible reference point, but then I didn't think that would be fair, because I think we have to allow him to rethink his precedents, to think of himself in a new way. But I will say that if those are any guide, then he prefers a kind of very traditional realism that looks in some ways like the presidential portraits from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Obama doesn't have a tie, and that's an interesting point, yes. And there, I think we can look at that as a very modern affect. The absence of the tie indicates a kind of casualness. But in this case, it's not a casualness like that of Ike or of Gerald Ford, who are kind of inviting us to be chummy and friendly with them. There's an intensity. And in fact, I think in some ways, for us in modern society, a tie represents a very formal idea of power. But the unbuttoned tie, the loosened tie, or the absence of the tie implies someone in a work environment who's ready to get to work. I think it's a more active kind of posture, like rolling up one's sleeves, these other sort of sartorial affectations that modify our sense of the formality of dress. In this case, make Obama seem intense and serious and active and not so formal. And of course, that is in keeping with the relative informality of this picture vis-a-vis the other examples in the recent past he was working from. Do I teach any continuing education courses at UNF? I have not so far, although I've thought about teaching for the Osher Lifelong Learning Center in recent years. And I'm always happy to have members of the community through our auditor program as participants in my classes. And UNF has a wonderful group of auditors who take classes, senior auditors and others who just want to sit in on a class for no credit. So. Well, that said, I want to conclude by saying thank you all, especially if you attended more than one of these. I really appreciate you turning out to support the Cummer and to support UNF and to support the vitality of our cultural institutions and of the knowledge resources, the history resources that we have in our community. I greatly value your participation, and I look forward to seeing you all again in the future, in the real world, back at the museum when life gets back to normal. Until then, everyone stay safe, be well, be kind, and do good works.
Thank you
so much.
Your lecture itself was transformational. It was an excellent tour of American presidential portraits. It was a delightful and informative journey through history, and I can't thank you enough. It was just superb. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, everyone, and good night.